Clara Rusk was 12 and carrying a pail from the well when she saw the cabin door open just wide enough for a hand. A blanket came through the gap, thin, patched, trailing a burnt edge, and dropped into the snow. Then the door shut. The iron latch fell with a sound Clara could hear from across the yard. The girl in the snow did not knock again. She stood barefoot in torn overshoes, holding the blanket to her chest, and looked at the barn where 8 cows breathed steam into the dark. Then she walked toward it, and Clara understood, without anyone telling her, that the door was not going to open again. Marit Brekke had not chosen the Varley farm. The farm had been chosen for her the way most things were chosen for orphan girls on the northern plains, by the absence of anyone willing to argue otherwise. Her mother, Guro, died of lung fever in a Minnesota boarding house when Marit was 12. Her father, a farm laborer named Marit Brekke, remarried within the year, not from cruelty, but from arithmetic. A man with a daughter and no wife needed a household. He married Prudence Varley's widowed sister, and when that woman died too, Peter drifted into the Varley orbit like a stone rolling downhill. He worked Amos Varley's acreage near the Cheyenne River in northern Dakota Territory. He died beneath an overturned freight wagon 2 winters later, leaving Marit with no legal claim, no blood relation in the household, and no money for passage anywhere else. The Varleys kept her the way one keeps a tool that costs nothing. She milked 8 cows before dawn. She hauled water from a well that froze shut 3 months of the year. She mucked stalls, split kindling, boiled wash, scrubbed floors, emptied ash, and fed chickens that pecked her wrists bloody. She slept near the kitchen hearth when Amos and his 2 grown sons, Wade and Ellis, were in fair temper. When they were not, she slept on a blanket behind the stove, where the draft cut under the door and the iron ticked as it cooled. They called her the extra mouth. Prudence said it first, and the phrase stuck. It followed Marit through every room of the cabin like a smell she could not wash out. By January of 1888, the Varley household had entered the kind of arithmetic that turns families mean. The coal supply sat at less than a week's worth. The woodpile was a joke, a few armloads of cottonwood so green it hissed in the stove and gave more smoke than heat. Prudence counted coal lumps into a tin pan each morning the way a banker counts currency, and she made sure Marit saw her do it. Every lump was a message. Every lump said, "You cost us." Marit shook frozen dung chips from a burlap sack one morning and sorted them by dryness on the barn floor. The driest ones would burn. The damp ones would smolder and stink. She stacked sunflower stalks along the wall by size, pulling the fattest stems for fuel and leaving the thin ones for kindling. Wood was too precious to burn freely, and coal from town cost cash that Amos refused to spend on a girl who was not his daughter, not his wife, and not, as he reminded anyone who asked, his responsibility. The cabin stove was cracked along one side. A split in the iron ran from the firebox door to the flue collar, and when the wind pressed against the west wall, smoke leaked into the room in a thin gray ribbon that made Prudence cough and made Amos curse. He had patched it twice with stove cement and once with a flattened tin can. None of the patches held. The barn held 8 dairy cows, 2 horses, and enough hay to keep the animals alive through February if nobody wasted it for bedding. The hay was the one thing the Varleys had in surplus, because Amos had cut a neighbor's field on shares the previous summer. But hay was for cattle. Hay was not for girls. Marit owned what she could carry in 2 hands: 1 patched wool dress, 1 shawl knitted by her mother, 1 thin blanket with a burn hole near the hem, a pocket knife with a loose blade, and a broken mercury thermometer that Guro had once used in the milk room back in Minnesota. The glass tube had a crack near the bulb, and the mercury column stopped at 68 degrees, but below that it still moved. Marit kept it in a leather scrap tied with thread. She had no relatives within 100 miles. She had no money. She had no legal claim to the Varley team, the Varley wagon, or any share of the Varley stores. She could not walk to the nearest town in winter. The distance was 14 miles, and the road disappeared under snow for weeks at a time. Leaving was not an option because leaving meant dying on a frozen road with no one to find her until spring. A neighbor rode in on a Tuesday and said the weather was about to turn. He had heard from the mail carrier, who had heard from the telegraph office in Lisbon, that a cold front was moving south from Canada. How cold? The neighbor pulled his collar up and said, 40 below, maybe worse, the kind that kills horses standing up. That was the number, 40 below. It hung in the air of the Varley kitchen like a sentence from a judge. Simeon Bell arrived the next morning on a bay gelding with ice crusted in its mane. Bell was the township constable, a former army teamster with a face like a hatchet and hands that had loaded freight wagons from Fort Rice to Deadwood. He was not a warm man. He was a thorough one. He rode to every farmstead before a bad front and told people what they already knew but did not want to hear. He found Amos splitting the last of the green cottonwood in the yard. He told him no one should be outside after the front hit. No exceptions. No quick trips to the barn, no walking to the well. Then he saw Marit. She was carrying 2 pails of water from the pump, barefoot inside torn overshoes that flapped with every step. Her shawl was wrapped over her head and knotted under her chin. Her fingers were red and cracked. She did not look at Bell. She looked at the ground in front of her feet and walked the way people walk when they have learned that making eye contact invites comment. Bell watched her cross the yard and set the pails on the kitchen step. He turned to Amos. That girl have proper boots? Amos shrugged. She has what she has. Bell looked at the barn, then back at the cabin. He asked where Marit slept. Amos said near the hearth, sometimes. Bell asked what sometimes meant. Amos said it meant what it meant. Bell dismounted and walked to where Marit was wringing her hands over the pails, trying to get feeling back into her fingers. He spoke to her directly, and the fact that he spoke to her at all surprised her enough that she looked up. You understand what 40 below means? She nodded. A barn will kill quicker than the open road, Bell said. His voice carried no sentiment. It carried experience. At least on the road you know you are dying. In a barn you fall asleep thinking you are warm enough, and by morning your blood has stopped. I've seen it. Grown men frozen inside their own walls. Marit said nothing. She picked up the pails and carried them inside. Bell remounted. He told Amos to keep the stove running and the door sealed. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, all of them inside, including the girl. Amos smirked as Bell rode away. He said nothing to Marit about the warning. That evening, when Prudence complained that the stove was eating coal too fast, Amos said the girl could sleep in the barn if she kept stealing heat from the cabin. He said it with a laugh, the way a man says something cruel and pretends it is a joke. But Marit heard the architecture beneath the laugh. She heard the decision already made. She heard the door closing before it closed. The temperature outside was still above 0. The false warmth that had settled over the northern plains, that strange deceptive mildness that the January of 1888 would become infamous for, still held. Children had walked to school without coats that week. Farmers had left doors open. The sky was calm, and the wind was low, and every living thing on the prairie was being lied to by the weather. Marit did not know the word for what was coming, but she knew Amos, and she knew that when the cold arrived, the cabin door would not open for her. The door closed on a Thursday evening. Marit had been milking the last cow, a brindle named Mottle, who kicked when the pail was cold. She carried the milk inside and set it on the table. Prudence was counting coal. Ellis was asleep on the bench. Wade sat by the stove cleaning his nails with a blade. Marit reached for the bread on the sideboard. Prudence said, "That is for morning." Marit pulled her hand back. She stood in the kitchen with milk on her sleeve and nothing in her stomach and waited. Prudence did not look at her. Amos came in from the yard, stamped his boots, and said the wind had shifted. "Get to the barn," he said. "Check the animals." She went. She checked the water trough, broke the ice skin, and topped the hay in each stall. When she came back to the cabin door, the latch was down. She could hear the iron bar on the inside. She knocked. No one answered. She knocked again. Wade's voice came through the wood, muffled and pleased with itself. "Barn is warm enough for cows. Ought to be warm enough for you." A minute later, the door opened just wide enough for a hand. Prudence pushed Marit's thin blanket through the gap and let the door fall shut. Marit stood in the yard with the blanket in her arms. The sky was enormous and pale. The barn lantern swung on its hook where she had left it, casting a yellow arc across the frozen mud. Inside the barn, 8 cows breathed and shifted. The sound was low and heavy, like a pulse. She did not cry. She did not knock again. She picked up the blanket, crossed the yard, and pushed open the barn door. The floor was frozen hard enough to ring under her shoes. Wind came through the wall seams in thin lines she could feel on her face like threads pulled tight. The air smelled of hay, manure, and the sour warmth of animals. The cows stood in their stalls with their heads low, chewing or still, their sides expanding with each breath. Steam rose from their backs in faint curls that disappeared before they reached the beams. Marit set the lantern on a nail and looked at the barn the way a person looks at a room they must now live in. Not the way she had looked at it 1,000 times before, as a place of chores, now as a place of survival. And something her mother had taught her surfaced in the dark, like a coin turning over in deep water. Marit Brekke had been a dairymaid's daughter in Minnesota before she was a laborer's wife in Dakota. She knew cattle the way some women knew quilting or bread, with her hands, her nose, her bare skin against hide and wood and frozen iron. One evening, when Marit was 8, Guro had taken her into the calf shed after chores. The shed was small, low-roofed, holding 4 calves and a yearling heifer. The air near the floor was cold. The straw was damp. Marit wanted to leave, but Guro took Marit's hand and lifted it slowly upward. Near the floor, the air bit. At waist height, it softened. At shoulder height, it was warm. At the low rafters, it was almost hot, thick with the smell of milk and hide and breath. "Feel that?" Guro said. Marit nodded. "Heat is not only made by fire," Guro said. "It gathers where it is trapped." Then she held a candle under an overturned tin cup and let Marit press her palm against the cup's bottom. The tin grew hot. The candle was small. The heat was large because it had nowhere to go but up, into the metal, into Marit's hand. Marit had filed that lesson the way children file most lessons, without understanding, without urgency, as a fact belonging to a world that did not yet need it. Now standing in the Varley barn with a thin blanket and no fire, and a storm moving across the prairie toward her, the lesson returned, not as memory, as instruction. She held her broken thermometer near the barn floor. The mercury barely moved. The cold down there was absolute, heavy, settled like water in a ditch. She climbed onto the stall rail and held the thermometer above the cows, near the beams where the haymow flooring began. The mercury rose, not far, not enough for comfort, but enough to prove that the invisible layer her mother had shown her was here too, in this barn, above these animals, a pocket of warmth that nobody had thought to use because nobody slept above cattle. 8 cows. Each one ran an internal temperature near 102 degrees. Each one shed heat through its hide, its breath, its mass, the way a stove sheds heat through iron. The difference was that a stove needed fuel. The cows were the fuel. They burned hay and turned it into body heat, and that heat rose because heat rises, and it gathered where the roof trapped it because heat gathers where it is trapped. The barn was not warm, but it was not uniformly cold. It had layers, and the highest layer, the one closest to the low hay-mow ceiling above the stalls, was the warmest place on the Varley property that did not require coal, wood, or fire. Marit looked at the stall partitions. Thick oak planks set into posts, strong enough to hold a cow pushing sideways. She looked at the space between the top of the partitions and the hay-mow floor above, about 4.5 feet, narrow, dark, full of rising heat and animal breath. She thought, I can build a shelf. She thought, I can sleep above the cows. She thought, everyone will say I am insane. And then she began to look for boards. She found 6 planks stacked behind the grain bin, scrap lumber from a fence repair that Wade had never finished. 2 fence rails leaned against the far wall. A coil of binder twine hung from a nail. Rawhide strips from a broken harness lay curled in a bucket of old tack. She dragged the first plank to the stall partitions and laid it across the tops of 2 walls over the space where the cows stood below. The plank spanned the gap. It bowed slightly under her hand when she pressed. It would need support. She was tying the first rawhide strip around the plank and the partition post when Ella Quince appeared in the barn door. Ella was 17, a neighbor's daughter who did wash for 3 families and sometimes borrowed kitchen tools before storms. She had come for a milk strainer. She stood in the doorway with her shawl pulled tight and her mouth slightly open, watching Marit lash a board across the top of a cow stall. What are you doing? Marit did not stop tying. Building a place to sleep. Up there? Where the heat is. Ella stepped closer. She looked at the platform, 1 board, loosely tied, suspended above 800 pounds of dairy cow. She looked at the cows who stood beneath it with the total indifference of animals who have no concept of engineering. You will smother up there, Ella said. Her voice was not cruel. It was careful, the way a person speaks when they believe they are watching someone make a fatal mistake. The air above cattle is foul, ammonia, damp. You will breathe it all night, and by morning your lungs will be full of it, or the boards will break and the cows will trample you. Marit stopped tying. She looked at Ella. She did not dismiss what Ella said, because Ella was not wrong. Ammonia from urine-soaked bedding rose with the heat. Damp air could soak a blanket and turn warmth into a killing chill. A loose board over a panicked animal was a death sentence. What if I leave a gap? Marit said. Not sealed, just blocked on the wind side. Open on the lee. Then the wind comes through the open side and you freeze. Not if the gap is high. The wind pushes low through the wall cracks. The warm air sits above it. If I block the direct draft and leave a vent near the ridge, the foul air escapes up and the warm air stays in the middle. Ella stared at her. You sound like you have done this before. My mother did, with calves. Ella shook her head slowly. She picked up the milk strainer from the shelf by the door. She said, I will pray for you. And she meant it without irony, the way people on the plains said it when they believed someone was about to die and could not be stopped. Marit went back to tying. She moved the platform to a better position, not directly above the cows' backs, where a startled animal could buck into the boards, but above the feed alley edge, where the stall partitions were thickest and the rising heat still pooled. She lashed each board to the partition tops with rawhide strips and binder twine, testing each joint by pressing her full weight onto it. She hung 3 burlap grain sacks along the windward side, stitching them together with twine to form a rough curtain that blocked the sharpest drafts. She packed loose hay into the roof cracks above her platform, pressing it into the gaps with her fingers until the worst of the high leaks were sealed. But she left a finger-wide gap near the ridge on the lee side, a vent for the ammonia and moisture to escape, just wide enough to let foul air out without letting the wind pour in. Every detail cost her fingers. The raw hide was stiff, the twine cut into her palms. She climbed up and down the stall rail a dozen times, and each time her torn overshoes slipped on the frozen wood, and she caught herself on a beam that drove splinters into her wrist. The cows watched her the way cows watch everything, with placid, unblinking patience, as if the universe were a slow event they had agreed to attend. By the next morning, the community knew. Wade told it at the store like a joke. "She's building herself a nest over the cows," he said. He was leaning against the counter with a grin that invited laughter, dragging boards up there, tying sacks to the walls, like a chicken on a roost. The men laughed. Not all of them, but enough. "Building yourself a coffin with rungs," Wade had said to Marit directly, and the line followed her into town. People repeated it. It became the phrase that attached to her name, the girl in the Varley barn, building a coffin with rungs. Amos let the joke travel because it served him. If Marit survived, she was useful labor that cost him nothing. If she died, the storm killed her, and Amos was blameless. Either way, the joke made him look powerful and her look foolish, and power on the frontier was often nothing more than the ability to make someone else's suffering entertaining. Simeon Bell heard the story on his second round of warning visits. He rode to the Varley place and found Marit at the pump, cracking ice from the handle with the heel of her hand. "I hear you are sleeping in the barn," Bell said. "I'm sleeping where I was told to sleep." "A barn is not shelter. I told you that." "You told Amos to keep me inside." "He did not." Bell sat on his horse and looked at the barn. He looked at the cabin. He looked at the thin trail of smoke from the cracked stove that was already eating through the last of the Varley coal. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "If that girl freezes, it is not the weather that killed her." He said it to Amos, who had come out onto the step to see why the constable was back. Amos leaned against the door frame and crossed his arms. "She chose the barn," Amos said. Marit, still at the pump, still cracking ice, said without turning around, "I chose the warmest place you left me." The words carried across the yard. Bell heard them. Amos heard them. Prudence heard them through the cabin window. Nobody answered, because there was no answer that did not sound like either an admission or a lie. Amos went inside. The door closed. But something had shifted in the yard, not in Amos's favor. Marit had said the thing that everyone knew and nobody wanted to name, and saying it had cost her. That evening, Prudence removed the ladder from the barn. She told Marit to sleep on the floor if she wanted to play animal. Wade went into the barn after dark and loosened one of the knots on the burlap windbreak. He did not cut it. He simply pulled it until the lashing slipped, so that when the wind gusted, the curtain would slap open and the draft would pour through. Marit found it an hour later when the burlap flapped loose against her face in the dark. She retied it. She used a double knot this time, pulling the rawhide so tight it bit into the grain sack. She checked every other lashing on the platform. She checked the vent gap. She checked the boards. Cruelty she was learning could sabotage the physics. A good design meant nothing if someone untied it while she slept. She had a design. She had a reason it should work. She had a broken thermometer that proved the warm layer existed. But she also had a family that knew enough about the platform to destroy it, and a storm that was still coming, and a body that was already tired from labor and hunger and cold. The wind shifted again that night. The false mildness that had fooled the entire northern plains began to crack. The air had a new edge. The cows shifted in their stalls and turned their heads away from the wall cracks. The horses stamped. Marit climbed onto her platform in the dark and pulled the blanket over her shoulders. The warmth from the cows rose around her in a slow, invisible tide. She held the thermometer near the burlap pocket and watched the mercury climb. Not far, not enough, but climbing. She did not know whether it would hold. She did not know whether the boards would last. She did not know whether the vent was right or the curtain was sealed enough, or the hay in the roof cracks would keep out the wind that people said could kill a horse standing up. She knew only that the heat was there, that it rose, that it gathered where it was trapped, and that by tomorrow the thing that would test her was no longer Amos Varley or Wade's cruelty or Prudence's locked door. It was 40 below. She woke before dawn to the sound of a horse blowing hard in the yard. Marit had slept on the platform for only a few hours, curled on her side with the blanket pulled over her head and her knees drawn to her chest. The warmth from the cows had held through the night, not comfort, but survival. The thermometer, wedged between two hay tufts near her shoulder, read somewhere in the low 50s. Her blanket was damp from the moisture rising off the cattle below, and her hair stuck to her neck in cold, wet strands. But she was alive, and the boards had not broken, and the burlap curtain was still tied. The horse in the yard stamped and snorted. Marit climbed down from the platform, using the stall partition rails as a ladder since Prudence had taken the real one. She crossed the barn floor, pushed the door open a hand's width, and looked out. A man she had never seen was dismounting a dun mare with a limp in its off hind. He was 50 or older, built like a fence post, narrow, weathered, hard to break. His coat was pieced from two different hides, one elk and one cowhide, stitched along the shoulder with rawhide so old it had turned the color of dark honey. He wore a fur cap with the ear flaps down and walked with a hitch in his left leg, as if something in the knee had been broken once and set badly. He tied the mare to the Varley fence rail and looked at the barn. Then he looked at the cabin. Then he walked to the cabin door and knocked. Amos opened it. The man asked whether the Varleys had spare shelter for his mare. He said his name was Tolef Asen. He said he was hauling freight between rail points, and the storm had pushed him off the track. He needed a night's stall and would pay in labor or coin. Amos looked at the mare and calculated. A stall cost him nothing. A man's labor for a day was worth something. He said Tolef could stable the mare in the barn and sleep in the haymow if he split wood first. Tolef split wood for an hour. He split it cleanly, with an economy of motion that said he had split 10,000 cords before this one and intended to waste no effort on the 10,001st. Then he led his mare into the barn. He saw the platform immediately. He stood in the feed alley with his mare's lead in one hand and looked up at the boards lashed across the stall partitions, the burlap curtain stitched along the windward side, the hay packed into the roof cracks, the gap left near the ridge. He did not laugh. He did not shake his head. He stood still the way a man stands when he is reading something that has been written in wood and rope instead of ink. Marit was in the far stall, forking hay to mottle. She watched him looking at the platform and waited for the joke. Everyone else had made a joke. Tolef said, "What are you measuring?" The question surprised her. Not "what are you building?" Not "what is that?" What are you measuring? Where the heat goes, she said. Tolliff nodded. He reached up and pressed his bare palm against the underside of one of the platform boards. He held it there for several seconds. Then he pressed his palm against the stall partition at waist height, then against the barn floor. 3 different temperatures, he said. You're sleeping in the warmest one. Trying to. He walked the length of the platform, testing each board with his hand, pressing down on the lashings, examining the knots. He found the one Wade had loosened and retied. He could see the double knot Marit had used to replace the original. Someone undid this, he said. Marit did not answer. Tolliff looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "Show me the rest." He did not teach her the way a schoolmaster teaches, by lecturing from a position of authority. He taught her the way a craftsman teaches, by putting his hands on the problem and letting her watch what his hands did. The first lesson was load path. He took one of Marit's platform boards and laid it across 2 stall walls. He pressed down on the center. The board bowed. He pressed harder. The board creaked. He pointed to the ends where the board rested on the partition tops. Weight goes from your body, through the board, into the walls, into the ground, Tolliff said. That is the path. If the path is good, the board holds. If the path is broken, rotten wood, a cracked rail, a post that has shifted, the weight has nowhere to go, and the board comes down. He picked up a hammer from the Varley tool shelf and struck the board. It rang. A solid sound, bright and short. He struck a second board, one of the older fence scraps. The sound was duller, softer, with a dead quality that swallowed the impact. Hear that? He said. Dead wood. Rot inside. It will hold today and break tomorrow. Use the ones that ring. Marit struck every board in her platform. 2 rang dead. She replaced them with planks from the back of the grain bin, boards she had passed over because they were shorter. Tolliff showed her how to overlap short boards on a partition top so the joint sat directly on the support, not in the gap between walls. The second lesson was knots and lashings. Tolliff took a strip of rawhide and soaked it briefly in the warm water of the cow trough. The leather softened. He wrapped it around a rail and a post in a pattern Marit had not seen. Over, under, over, pulled tight, crossed, and wrapped again. A square lashing. Rawhide shrinks when it dries, he said. Soak it, tie it, and by morning it will be tighter than any knot you can pull by hand, but only if the wrap is flat. Bunched rawhide does not shrink evenly. It twists, and the joint shifts. He made her redo the lashing 4 times. Each time he tested the rail by shaking it. The first 3 times it moved. The 4th time it held. Again, he said. She did it again. It held on the first try. The third lesson was breath and venting. Tolliff climbed onto the stall rail carefully, favoring his bad knee, and examined the roof cracks above the platform. He pointed to a spot where frost bloomed thick on the underside of a board, a white crystal crust that glittered in the lantern light. See that frost? He said. That is moisture trying to escape. Warm air from the cows carries water. The water hits the cold roof and freezes. If you seal everything, the moisture stays inside your pocket. It soaks your blanket. Wet cloth against skin in cold air will kill you faster than no blanket at all. He showed her the vent gap she had already left near the ridge. He approved of it. But he said it was on the wrong side. You left the vent on the lee side. That is where the wind is calmest. Good for blocking draft, bad for pulling air. Moisture needs to be drawn out. Move the vent to the side where the wind creates a low pressure. The lee side pulls air toward it. Block the windward cracks. Leave the lee vent open. The wind will suck the foul air out for you. Marit adjusted the hay packing. She sealed the windward gaps tighter and opened the lee vent wider. Not much, just enough that she could feel a faint current when she held her hand near it. The current meant air was moving. Air moving meant moisture leaving. Tolef watched her work and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Your mother taught you something about heat." It was not a question. "She taught me that heat gathers where it is trapped," Marit said. Tolef nodded. "That is half of it. The other half is that trapped heat turns wet, and wet turns deadly. You had the first half right. Now you have both." They worked through the afternoon. Marit strengthened the platform while Tolef tended his mare and repaired a broken stall latch that had been swinging loose since autumn. He did not offer to build the platform for her. He corrected what she built. The difference mattered. One was charity, the other was respect. She lashed all 6 boards across the stall partitions, overlapping the short ones on the support posts. She added the 2 fence rails as cross braces, tying them beneath the boards to prevent sideways shift. She hung the burlap curtain along the windward wall from the haymow floor to the top of the stalls, stitching the sacks together so tightly that the draft dropped to a whisper. She packed the remaining hay into every windward crack she could reach, using her pocket knife to press it deep. The platform was 4.5 feet above the frozen barn floor. It was narrow, just wide enough for her shoulders and hips, with hay bedding laid over the boards and her blanket on top. It was not a room. It was a crawl space, a shelf, a slot cut into the warmest layer of air in the barn. She tested the thermometer at 3 heights. The floor read below freezing. The mercury barely moved. The stall rail, at about 3 feet, was warmer but damp, the air heavy with cow breath and ammonia. Inside the burlap pocket, with the cows settled and the windbreak closed, the mercury climbed past 50, past 55. The cows had not yet lain down, and when cattle lie down, they radiate more heat upward from their broad sides. Tolef saw the reading and said, "When those animals settle for the night and that wind stays blocked, you will see 60, maybe higher in the small hours." "High enough?" "High enough if you stay dry. Wet blanket at 60 degrees will still chill you. Dry blanket at 50 will keep you alive." He showed her one more thing. He took a handful of dry hay and held it near the vent gap. The hay strands fluttered, outward, toward the lee. Air was moving. Moisture was leaving. The system was breathing. Amos came to the barn that afternoon. He saw Tolef examining the platform and Marit tying a lashing on the crossbrace. He looked at the construction the way a man looks at something he cannot control and does not understand. "She is playing house with cow boards," Amos said. He said it to Tolef, as if Marit were not standing 6 feet away. Tolef finished testing a knot. He did not look at Amos immediately. When he did, his voice was flat and unimpressed. "No," Tolef said. "She's seeing something you missed." Amos's face changed, not to anger, to something smaller, to the look of a man who has been dismissed by someone he cannot dismiss back. Tolef was not a neighbor whose opinion could be mocked in town. Tolef was a stranger, a freighter, a man who had wintered in places Amos had only heard stories about. His judgment carried a weight that Amos could not laugh away. Amos turned and walked back to the cabin without speaking. If you have ever been laughed at by someone who did not understand what you were building, tell us in the comments, because Marit still had to prove her idea before the cold proved Amos right. The setbacks came in sequence, as if the world were testing whether Marit deserved what she was building. Wade stole one of the fence rails while Marit was hauling water. She came back to find the cross brace gone, and 2 boards sagging where the support had been pulled free. She replaced it with a section of stall gate that she pried loose with her knife and Tolef's hammer. The gate section was shorter. She had to relash 2 boards to reach it. An hour of work to fix 5 minutes of cruelty. Model. the brindle cow with the bad temper, kicked a sideboard loose during evening milking. The board cracked along a grain line and dropped into the stall. Marit fished it out, flipped it, and lashed it back with the cracked side down so the weight would press the split closed instead of opening it. Tolliff saw her do it and said nothing, which meant she had done it correctly. Prudence refused Marit a second blanket. Marit did not ask twice. She took an empty grain sack from the barn, filled it with dry hay, and laid it beneath her blanket as insulation between her body and the boards. Hay was not wool, but hay held air, and trapped air held heat, and Marit was learning to think in layers. By late afternoon, Tolliff said he had to leave. His mare was stabled and rested, but he had freight to account for at the rail point. He needed to retrieve cargo from a drifted draw a few miles east before the storm buried it for good. "If the wind lets me," he said, "I will come back by morning." Marit nodded. She did not ask him to stay. She understood that asking a man like Tolliff to stay was the same as saying she could not manage alone, and she would not say that, because saying it might make it true. Tolliff led his mare out of the barn. At the door he stopped and looked back at the platform, the boards, the curtain, the vent, the lashings he had taught her to tie. "Keep the cows calm," he said. "Calm animals breathe steady. Steady breath makes steady heat. If they panic, the heat scatters." Then he was gone, and the barn was hers, and the light outside had begun to change. The afternoon was strangely warm. That was the wrong word. The afternoon was strangely not cold. The air had a softness to it that did not belong to January in Dakota Territory. Children had walked to school that morning without coats. A farmer on the Lisbon road had left his cabin door open to let the cat out, and had not closed it for an hour. Marit stood at the barn door and looked at the sky. It was too calm. The clouds sat low and flat, a gray ceiling that pressed down on the prairie like a lid. The wind had stopped entirely. No movement in the grass stubble, no drift pattern on the snow. The world was holding its breath. The cows knew before she did. Mottle stopped chewing. The other cows lifted their heads one by one, turning toward the north wall as if they could hear something through the boards that human ears could not reach. The horses stamped and swung their heads. A hen on the barn floor ruffled every feather at once and pressed herself against the wall. Marit watched the animals and felt the hair rise on her arms. Then the sky moved. It came from the northwest, not as a cloud, but as a wall, a white-gray mass that erased the horizon and came on fast, faster than Marit had ever seen weather move. The light changed from gray to yellow to a strange dark amber. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the time it took her to close the barn door. Snow began, not as flakes, as white grit, fine, hard, driven horizontal by a wind that arrived like a door slamming. The barn boards groaned, the latch jumped. A crack in the north wall that Marit had not noticed suddenly sang, a thin high whistle that cut through the sound of animals shifting. She had minutes, maybe less. She checked the windbreak, tight. She checked the vent, open. She checked the lashings. The one Wade had loosened once. She pulled it again, hard, until the rawhide creaked. She checked the hay packing in the roof cracks. She checked her blanket, her grain sack mattress, her thermometer. She climbed onto the platform and pulled the blanket over her legs. The warmth was there. The cows had been standing all day, eating hay, turning feed into body heat, and the heat had been rising into the pocket for hours. The burlap curtain held the windward draft. The vent drew the damp air out. The thermometer, wedged near her hip, read 58 degrees. Below her, 8 cows settled into their stalls with the slow heaviness of animals preparing for a long night. One by one they folded their legs and lay down, their broad sides pressing against the stall walls, their breath coming in long, even pulls. When a cow lies down, its mass radiates heat upward in a wide field. 8 cows lying down turned the space above the stalls into something Marit could feel on her face. A warmth like standing near a banked stove, not hot, but present, steady, and real. The thermometer climbed past 60. Outside, the wind hit full force, and the barn became a drum. The first hour was wet. The rising heat carried moisture from the cows, their breath, the damp of their hides, the faint steam from fresh manure. The moisture hit the cold boards above Marit's head and condensed. Drops formed on the underside of the haymow floor and fell onto her blanket in a slow, irregular patter. Within 40 minutes, the wool was clammy. She could feel the dampness seeping through to her dress. Wet wool would kill her, not in minutes, but in hours. The moisture would wick heat from her body faster than the cows could replace it. Tollef's warning about wet blankets came back to her like a hand on her shoulder. Dry blanket at 50 will keep you alive. Wet blanket at 60 will still chill you. She shifted the hay beneath her, pulling dry tufts from the grain sack and pressing them between the blanket and the boards. The hay absorbed some of the drip. She angled the blanket so the condensation ran toward the edge and dripped into the stall below instead of pooling under her back. She was not comfortable. She was solving a problem with her hands in the dark, while the wind screamed through the wall cracks below. The thermometer read 62. The second hour tried to kill her. Wade came into the barn. She heard the cabin door first, a bang that carried over the wind, then boots on frozen ground, then the barn latch lifting. The barn door swung open, and the wind entered like a fist. Every degree of warmth that had gathered in the upper space scattered. The burlap curtain bellied inward and snapped against the stall wall. The cows lurched to their feet, eyes wide, hooves scrabbling. Mottle bellowed. Wade stood in the doorway with a pail. He had come for milk. In the middle of a storm that was already driving snow through the wall cracks, he had come for milk because Prudence wanted milk for the morning, and the cabin stove was failing, and someone had decided that milk was more important than closing a door. He milked 1 cow. He did it slowly because he was cold and his hands were stiff, and he did not care about the heat that was pouring out of the barn, like water from an overturned bucket. When he was done, he picked up the pail, walked to the door, and left. He did not close the latch. The door banged open on the wind. Snow drove into the feed alley in a white sheet. The cows stood in their stalls, agitated, stamping, their calm destroyed. The warm layer above the platform collapsed. Marit felt it go, felt the temperature drop from 60 to 40-something in the time it took the wind to reach the rafters. The thermometer confirmed it. The mercury was falling. She climbed down. The descent was harder than any she had made. The stall rails were slick with condensation. Her hands were shaking from cold that had not touched her 5 minutes ago, and the cows were shifting in the dark, bumping against partitions and swinging their heads. She reached the feed alley floor, and the cold hit her full in the chest. The floor was a different world from the platform. Down here the air was brutal, heavy, sharp enough to make her gasp. She crossed the alley to the barn door. Snow stung her face. She grabbed the door edge and hauled it shut. The latch was a simple iron hook that dropped into a loop. Her fingers were numb. She missed the loop twice. On the third try, the hook caught, and she pressed it down and held it until she was sure the wind could not bounce it free. Then she stood in the dark barn at floor level and felt the cold closing around her like water rising. She had to get back up. She had to get above the cold, above the floor, into the layer where the cows' heat gathered. But the cows were standing now, nervous and shuffling, and the warmth they had been radiating while lying down was scattered. She climbed the stall rail. Her overshoe slipped. She caught herself on a partition post and pulled herself up, one arm over the platform edge, then the other, then her body rolling onto the wet boards. The blanket was cold. The hay beneath was damp. She lay still and waited. The cows, with nothing to fear except the noise they had already heard, began to settle. One by one they stopped stamping. One by one they lowered their heads. Mottle was the last to lie down, turning in her stall with the slow reluctance of an animal that has been startled and does not trust the quiet yet. 20 minutes passed. The burlap curtains stopped flapping. The vent began to draw again. The heat, patient and invisible, began to rebuild. The thermometer crept upward. 50, 53, 56. Marit's blanket was wet. She could not fix that. She turned onto her side and pulled the dry hay from the grain sack around her shoulders, making a cocoon of loose straw between her body and the wool. It was not a solution. It was a delay. But delay was all she needed. Delay until the cows settled and the heat rebuilt and the pocket closed around her again. The third hour brought Mottle, a sound from below, not a stamp, not a bellow, but a scraping, struggling sound. Marit leaned over the platform edge and looked down. In the faint light that leaked through the wall cracks, she could see Mottle thrashing her head sideways. The cow's halter rope had twisted around the stall post. Each time Mottle pulled, the rope tightened. The cow was panicking in slow motion, winding herself into a knot that was pulling her head down toward the floor. If Mottle fell, she would go down on her side. Her legs would hit the stall partition. The partition held 2 of Marit's platform boards. If the partition cracked, the boards would drop, and the platform Treji and Marit would come down into a stall with a panicked cow that weighed 800 pounds and could not see what it was kicking. Marit did not think about the cold below the platform. She did not think about the wet blanket or the lost heat or the storm outside. She thought about Tolef's knots. She thought about his hands on the rawhide flat wraps, no bunching, and the way he had tested the rail by shaking it. She climbed down. The feed alley floor hit her bare feet through the torn overshoes, with a cold so sharp it felt like stepping on glass. She moved to Mottle's stall and spoke to the cow before she touched her. Low words. Her mother's voice. The voice Guro had used in the calf shed. The voice that said, "I am not a threat. I am not in a hurry. I am here." Mottle's eye rolled toward her. The cow stopped pulling. Marit reached for the halter rope. It was wrapped twice around the post and cinched tight by the cow's own weight. She could not untie it while the cow was pulling. She needed slack. She pressed her shoulder against Mottle's neck and pushed. Not hard, steady. The cow shifted half a step forward. The rope slackened. Marit's fingers found the twist, lifted the loop over the post top, and unwound the rope. She did it without stepping behind the cow, without putting herself between Mottle's hind legs and the wall. Tolef had taught her that, not in words, but in the way he moved around animals, always to the side, never behind. The rope came free. Mottle shook her head and blew hard through her nostrils. Marit retied the halter with enough length for the cow to lie down, but not enough to wind. She stood in the stall with her feet going numb and her hands shaking and the cold pressing against her back like a wall of dark water. Then she climbed back up. The 4th hour showed her the cabin failing. Through a crack in the barn's east wall, Marit could see the Varley cabin. Or rather, she could see where the cabin was, a dark shape against the blowing snow, marked by the faintest orange glow from the window, where the stove should have been putting out light and heat. The chimney was barely smoking. The plume that should have risen thick and steady from a well-fed stove was thin, gray, guttering. The cracked iron was losing the fight. Damp fuel and a broken firebox and a wind that found every gap in the cabin walls. The family that had locked Marit out was running out of the heat they had hoarded. The thermometer on the platform read 64. The cows were down. The wind was blocked. The vent was drawing. Marit lay in her pocket and watched the cabin grow darker. She did not expect the knock. It came from the barn door. Not a knock exactly, but a scraping, a thumping, the sound of a hand hitting wood without enough strength to make a fist. Marit heard it between gusts, a rhythm too regular to be wind. She climbed down. Ellis Varley stood outside the barn door. He was hatless, coatless, wearing only his shirt and trousers and a pair of boots he had not laced. His face was white. His hands were curled against his chest. He was shaking so hard he could not speak. He had been sent for hay. Prudence had decided the stove needed fuel, and the only fuel left was hay from the barn, and she had sent her younger stepson out into a blizzard to fetch it, because the alternative was sitting in a cold cabin watching the stove die. Ellis had made it to the barn, but could not lift the latch. His fingers had stopped working. Marit looked at him. This was a boy who had laughed when Prudence took the ladder. A boy who had slept on the bench while she stood in the kitchen with an empty stomach. A boy who was part of the household that had locked the door and pushed a blanket through the gap and told her to sleep with the animals. He was also going to die if she did not open the door. She opened the door. The wind came in. The heat fled. The cows lurched and stamped. Everything she had rebuilt after Wade's visit scattered again. The warmth, the calm, the settled rhythm of animal breath that was keeping her alive. She grabbed Ellis by the shirt and pulled him into the feed alley. He fell. She kicked the door shut and fought the latch into its hook. Ellis lay on the frozen barn floor, shaking, his lips blue, his breath coming in short gasps that did not sound like breathing. They sounded like the noise an engine makes when the fuel is almost gone. She could not put him on the platform. The boards held her weight. They would not hold two. She pulled hay from the nearest stall and packed it around him on the floor. She put her blanket over him, her only blanket, the one her mother might have touched, the one that was already wet and would now get wetter. She tucked hay under the blanket and over it, building a mound around his body the way a person buries a fire to keep it alive. Then she climbed back onto the platform with no blanket and a body that was cooling rapidly in wet clothes. The cows had stood up again. 2 open doors in 1 hour had destroyed their rest. They shifted, stamped, breathed hard. The heat in the pocket was gone. The thermometer read 46. If you are invested in this story, stay with us, because this is the moment Marit's shelter stopped being only for her. Marit lay on the bare boards with her grain sack of hay pressed against her stomach and her arms wrapped around her chest. She shivered. The shivering was violent enough to shake the platform, and the boards creaked, and for one bad moment she thought the lashings would give. She breathed the way the cows breathed, slow, deep, measured. She made herself small. She made herself still. She waited for the animals to settle because there was nothing else she could do. She could not generate heat. She could not close the gaps that Wade and Ellis had opened. She could only lie still and wait for 8 living furnaces to lie down and pump warmth into the air above their stalls. It took 40 minutes. Model went down first, which surprised her. Model was the nervous one, the kicker, the one who startled at shadows. But Model had been calmed once tonight already, and maybe the voice Marit had used in the stall had stayed with her. Or maybe Model was simply tired. The others followed one by one, folding their legs and settling their weight onto the straw with a sound like grain shifting in a sack. The heat began to return. Marit felt it on her face before the thermometer confirmed it. A slow warming, like dawn arriving from below instead of above. 50 degrees, 54, 58. She had no blanket. She had wet clothes. She had a body that was burning stored energy to maintain its own temperature and would not be able to do so forever. But the hay from the grain sack was dry, and she packed it around herself the way she had packed it around Ellis, and the platform boards beneath her held the warmth that rose through them from below, and the burlap curtain blocked the wind, and the vent drew the wet air out. The thermometer climbed past 60, past 65, near the small pocket closest to the low roof, where the haymow boards trapped the rising heat in a space barely larger than a coffin. The mercury touched 70. Not 70 degrees in the barn. 70 degrees in a pocket the size of a body, inches below a low ceiling, directly above 8 settled cows, behind a windbreak, with a vent drawing moisture. 70 degrees because heat rises and gathers and holds where it is trapped, and because a girl who owned nothing except a dead woman's lesson had measured where the warmth went and put herself inside it. Below the platform, on the barn floor, Ellis stopped shaking. His breathing steadied. He slept under a pile of hay and a wet blanket and air that was still cold but no longer killing, because even the floor of a closed barn with 8 large animals was warmer than the cabin with a failing stove. Outside, the wind was trying to take the barn apart. It hit the north wall in gusts that flexed the boards and drove snow through every crack that Marit had not sealed. It shrieked through the ridge vent and made the burlap curtain billow and snap. The temperature on the open prairie dropped past 20 below, past 30 below. It was heading toward 40 below, and it would stay there until morning, and in the morning there would be bodies on the plains, men and women and children who had been caught by a storm that came in faster and harder than anything the territory had seen in living memory. Marit did not know that. She knew only the pocket. She knew the boards under her back and the hay against her skin and the steady breath of 8 cows rising around her like a tide that would not stop as long as the animals were alive and fed and calm. Near dawn, she heard the cabin door bang open. Through the crack in the east wall, she saw movement. Prudence stumbling into the yard, hands out, calling for Ellis. The cabin behind her was dark. The stove had quit. The family that had rationed their warmth and locked out the extra mouth had spent the night feeding a cracked stove with damp fuel, and the stove had lost. Then she heard something else. Hooves on frozen ground, a horse blowing hard. The sound of a man's voice, low and steady, talking to the animal the way a person talks when they have been traveling in the dark and are not sure what they will find. Tollef Asen rode into the Varley yard at first light. He had followed the sound of the cattle through the storm, not the road, which had disappeared, not the cabin smoke, which had died, but the low noise of 8 cows shifting and breathing in a closed barn. He tied his mare and opened the barn door slowly, expecting silence, expecting cold, expecting to find what he had found before in bad storms on the plains. He found Marit above the stalls. Her face was flushed. Her hair was damp and matted. One hand still held the thermometer. She was not comfortable. She was exhausted, dehydrated, shaking from hours of cold and labor and fear. Her clothes were wet. Her feet were numb. She had saved a boy who had helped lock her out, rebuilt a warm pocket after it collapsed twice, calmed a panicking cow in the dark, and spent the last hours of the worst storm in Dakota Territory, lying on 6 boards above 8 animals with no blanket and no fire, and no one to tell her whether she was right. But she was alive. The thermometer in her hand, wedged into the small burlap and hay pocket inches below the low haymow roof, read 75 degrees. Tollef looked at the reading. He looked at the platform. He looked at the lashings, the vent, the curtain, the hay in the roof cracks. He looked at Ellis sleeping on the barn floor under a mound of hay and a wet blanket. He looked at Marit. Your mother, he said. She knew something. Marit's voice was hoarse. She knew where heat goes. Tolef nodded once. He did not smile. He did not need to. His face held something that Marit had not seen directed at her in a very long time. The look of a person who recognizes what they are seeing and does not need to be told its name. Outside, the storm was breaking. The wind still came, but the gusts were shorter. The snow was falling instead of driving. Dawn leaked through the wall cracks in gray light that turned the barn from darkness into shadow, and from shadow into the first pale shapes of morning. The cows began to stir. Model stood first, shaking hay from her back, swinging her head toward the feed trough. The others followed. The heat in the pocket shifted as the animals rose, thinning slightly, spreading, but not gone. The barn was warm, not warm like a cabin. Warm like a place where life had burned through the night and left its mark in the air. Marit climbed down from the platform on legs that did not want to hold her. She stood in the feed alley and looked at the cabin through the open barn door. Prudence was on the step, arms crossed against the cold, staring at the barn. Amos stood behind her. Wade was nowhere. Ellis was still on the floor, waking under the hay, blinking, alive because a girl he had mocked had opened a door she did not have to open. Tolef put a hand on Marit's shoulder. Not gently. Firmly, the way you steady a person who has earned the right to stand but may not have the strength. Come inside, he said. He meant the cabin. He meant warmth and food and a chair. But Marit looked at the platform above the stalls, the boards, the curtain, the lashings that held through the night, and she did not move immediately. She stood in the feed alley with the cold barn floor under her torn shoes and the warm breath of cattle on her neck, and she let the morning find her where she was. She had survived, but more than survived. She had measured the invisible, built a shelter from knowledge, and kept a boy alive who had not deserved her help, but had received it anyway because survival, she understood now, was not a thing you hoarded. It was a thing you gave. The question the storm had asked, how can a girl with no fire survive a night that kills grown adults, had been answered. The next question was harder, and it was already forming in the cold air between the barn and the cabin, in the look on Amos's face, in the sound of Tolef's voice speaking to Prudence in words Marit could not hear but could guess. The next question was, what happens to a girl the community can no longer ignore? Tolef brought Marit into the cabin before the family could decide whether to let her in. He did not ask permission. He opened the door, put his hand on her back, and walked her to the table. Prudence stepped aside. Amos said nothing. The stove was barely warm, a few embers in a cracked firebox, and the cabin was colder than the barn had been at platform height. Tolef set water to heat over the last of the coals and made Marit drink it. Then he turned to Amos and said 6 words that rearranged the room. Your stove had flame. Her barn had judgment. Amos opened his mouth. Nothing came out that was worth hearing, and even he seemed to know it because he closed it again and looked at the floor. Tolef did not wait for a response. He walked back outside. Simeon Bell arrived 2 hours after dawn. His bay gelding was crusted with ice from nose to tail, and Bell himself moved as though the cold had gotten into his joints and refused to leave. He had tried to reach the Varley property before the worst of the storm and had failed. He had sheltered behind his horse in a draw a mile east, curled against the animal's ribs, and waited for the wind to slow enough to ride. He had frost on his beard that would not melt for another hour. He had the look of a man who had survived something he would rather not discuss. He entered the barn because Tolef told him to see it. He stood in the feed alley and looked up at the platform, the boards, the lashings, the burlap curtain, the hay packed into the roof cracks, the vent gap on the lee side. Bell was a practical man. He did not deal in sentiment. He dealt in evidence, which was why what he said next carried the weight it did. I told her the barn would kill quicker than the open road, Bell said. He said it to Tolef, but loudly enough that Amos heard it from the cabin step. I was wrong about this barn. He walked the length of the stalls, looking at the lashings, touching the boards, pressing his palm to the underside of the platform the way Tolef had done the day before. He asked how the vent worked. Marit told him. He asked why the curtain was only on the windward side. Marit told him. He asked what temperature she had measured. 75, she said. In the pocket. Not the whole barn, just the pocket. Bell looked at the pocket, the small space between the platform boards and the low hay-mow ceiling, barely large enough for a body, lined with hay and burlap and warmed by the combined heat of 8 dairy cows rising through a sealed channel of blocked drafts and controlled venting. How did you know to build this? My mother showed me that heat rises. I measured where it went. Bell nodded. He walked to the cabin and told Amos that Marit had kept Ellis alive. He said it flatly, without accusation, the way a constable delivers a fact that a household must now reckon with. He said the barn had outperformed the cabin because the girl had understood something about the building that the man who owned it did not. Amos said the stove was cracked. Anyone would have struggled. Bell said, she did not have a stove. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room like water and leaves no space for excuses. Prudence looked at her hands. Wade, who had appeared from wherever Wade went when there were consequences to be faced, leaned against the wall and said nothing. Ellis sat wrapped in a quilt at the table, alive, silent, unable to look at Marit because looking at her meant acknowledging what had happened and who had opened the door. The neighbors came within a week. News on the northern plains moved the way water moves through soil, slowly, through contact, filtering from one household to the next, along the paths that people walk to borrow flour, or check on cattle, or return a tool. By the end of the week, 4 families had heard that the Brekke girl had survived the blizzard in the Varley barn on a shelf above the cows. By the end of the 2nd week, people began showing up to look. They came carefully, the way frontier people approach anything they do not understand, not with open curiosity, but with practical questions and crossed arms and the expectation that the story had been exaggerated. They stood in the feed alley and looked up at the platform, and Marit stood beside them and answered what they asked. A woman named Dagny Solheim, whose husband's claim was 3 miles north, asked whether the method would work with fewer cows. Marit said she did not know. She said 8 cows in a low-roofed barn with good draft blocking had produced enough heat to reach 75 degrees in a tight pocket. Fewer cows, less heat, bigger barn, more heat loss. She would not guess at numbers she had not measured. A farmer named Peter Haugen asked how high the warm layer was. Marit showed him. She marked 3 heights on the barn wall with a piece of charcoal. Below the stall rail, freezing, deadly, do not sleep here. At stall rail height, warmer, damp, survivable while moving but not for sleeping. Above the stall partitions in a sealed pocket, warm enough to live through the night if the bedding stays dry and the vent stays open. A young mother named Christy Tveit, who had lost a calf to cold that same week, asked where to hang infant bedding during storms. Marit said above the animals, near the roof, where the heat collects, but never sealed, always vented because trapped moisture turns warmth into a killer. Marit answered only what she had tested. When Haugen asked whether horses produced enough heat to build a similar platform, she said she did not know. She had used cows. Cows lay down. Lying cows radiate heat upward from a wide surface. Horses stand. The heat pattern would be different. She would not claim what she had not measured. This precision, this refusal to extend beyond her evidence, earned her more respect than confidence would have. People on the plains had seen plenty of confidence. Confidence was cheap. Measurement was rare. Eloquence came on the third day. She stood in the barn doorway the way she had stood there before the storm, when she had told Marit she would smother. She looked at the platform. She looked at the vent. She looked at the hay in the roof cracks and the lashing marks on the partition posts. "I thought the air would kill you," Ella said. "I did not know you had given it a path." Marit said, "You were right about the danger. I just found the answer before the danger found me." Ella asked to be taught. Not the idea, she could see the idea, the execution. How tight the lashings needed to be, how wide the vent, how much hay in the cracks, where to place the platform so a falling board would not land on a cow. Marit showed her everything, and Ella's hands, which were strong from washing and wringing, learned the knots faster than Marit's had. This was the first teaching, and it changed something between them. Ella had doubted Marit's method. Now she was learning it. The conversion was not dramatic, no tearful admission, no public declaration. It was a woman tying a lashing on a barn post and finding that it held, and nodding and tying another. Amos Varley watched the visitors from the cabin window and understood that something was happening that he could not control. Marit's survival had been inconvenient. Her competence was worse. Every neighbor who walked into the barn and looked at the platform and asked questions was a neighbor who saw Amos differently afterward, not as the man who owned a clever worker, but as the man who had locked a girl out to freeze and been outperformed by her ingenuity. The joke about the coffin with rungs had turned on its author. Wade stopped repeating it. Amos tried to claim credit. He told Haugen that he had allowed the experiment, that he had given Marit access to the barn, the materials, the cows. Haugen looked at him and said nothing. The silence said everything, but Amos was not finished. He still held the thing that mattered most on the frontier, property. He owned the barn. He owned the cows. He owned the hay and the tools and the stalls. Marit owned nothing except skill, and skill without standing was vulnerable. Amos understood this the way a man understands a weapon he has always carried, instinctively, without needing to examine it. He told Marit she could stay. He said it as if it were a favor. He said she could keep the platform, keep the stall, keep milking the cows, keep hauling water. Everything the same. Nothing changed except that now the community knew what she could do, and Amos planned to make sure that what she could do stayed inside his barn, under his roof, attached to his name. Marit looked at him and said, "I am not staying." The words landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. Prudence looked up from the stove. Wade, who had been pretending to mend a harness strap, stopped pretending. Amos's face went through 3 expressions in the time it took Marit to finish the sentence. Surprise, then anger, then something colder. Calculation. "You have no wages," Amos said. "No family. No team. Where exactly are you going?" Tolif Asen answered from the doorway. He had been standing there long enough to hear, and he spoke with the flat certainty of a man delivering a freight manifest. "She's coming with me," Tolif said. "I need help wintering livestock on the claims east of here. I will pay her wages. She starts today." Amos looked at Tolif. He looked at Marit. He said, "She cannot leave." Simeon Bell, who had ridden in behind Tolif and was tying his horse to the fence, asked one question. "Do you have an indenture paper, Amos?" Amos did not. "Then she can leave," Belle said. Marit gathered what she owned: the patched wool dress, the shawl, the pocket knife, the broken thermometer in its leather scrap. She left the blanket. It was still damp, and it smelled of hay and cow breath and the worst night of her life, and she did not want to carry it. She walked out of the Varley cabin for the last time, crossed the yard, and climbed onto the bench of Tollef's freight wagon beside a man who had looked at her work and seen what it was instead of what it looked like. The first job was not glamorous. A widow named Ragna Flaten had a cowshed 3 miles east where 2 calves had already frozen. The shed was low, poorly chinked, and open to the north wind through gaps in the sod wall that no one had repaired since her husband's death the previous spring. Tollef and Marit arrived at midday. Tollef assessed the structure, tested the posts, checked the roof poles, examined the wall gaps with his hands. He told Marit what he saw. She told him what she would do. She lowered a temporary cloth ceiling over the animal corner, using feed sacks stretched between the low rafters. She raised the calf bedding off the frozen floor onto a frame of scrap rails, creating an air gap between the ground cold and the animals' bodies. She blocked the direct wind gaps on the north wall with packed hay and mud. She left a vent on the south side, high, where the warm air rising from the remaining cattle could draw moisture out without losing heat. It was the same principle, smaller scale, different building, but the physics held because physics does not care about the size of the barn or the name of the person applying it. Heat rises, cold settles. Gaps steal warmth. Block the gaps. Raise the living thing above the cold floor. Let the foul air escape, and the warm air does the rest. Ragna watched Marit work and asked where she had learned it. Marit said, "From my mother, and from a man who taught me to listen to wood." Tollef heard that and said nothing, but the corner of his mouth moved. They worked together through February. Tollef hauled freight. Marit rode with him or stayed behind to fix shelters on outlying claims. The arrangement was practical. Tollef's bad knee made climbing difficult, and Marit could get into spaces he could not reach. She was not his daughter. She was not his charity case. She was his employee, and he paid her in coin at the end of each week, and she kept the coins in a pouch she sewed from a scrap of Tollef's old elk-hide coat. He taught her to read buildings the way he read terrain. Where snow melts first on a roof tells you where heat is leaking. Where frost grows thickest on an inside wall tells you where cold is entering. Where wind leaves dust lines on a floor tells you where the draft runs. Where animals choose to stand tells you where the warmth gathers, because animals do not lie about comfort. Marit absorbed this the way she had absorbed her mother's lesson. Not as abstract knowledge, but as physical fact, something she could feel with her hands and confirm with her eyes and test with the broken thermometer that still worked below 68 degrees. They disagreed once, and the disagreement mattered. Tollef wanted to seal a hay barn completely on a claim near the Cheyenne, blocking every gap to trap heat for a sick horse inside. Marit said no. She said a sealed barn with a sick animal would turn the air foul within hours. The moisture from the horse's breathing would soak every surface. The ammonia would build. The horse might survive the cold, but die from its own atmosphere. Tollef looked at her. He had survived winters she could not imagine. He had wintered horses in places where the wind took the skin off your face. He was not accustomed to being told no by a 16-year-old girl. "You are certain?" he said. "I am certain because I almost made the same mistake," Marit said. "The first hour in the Varley barn, I sealed the pocket too tight. My blanket went wet in 40 minutes. The air got thick. If Ella had not told me I would smother, I might not have cut the vent." Tollef was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Leave the vent." They left the vent. The horse survived. And something shifted in the partnership. Not the balance of authority, because Tolef still knew more than Marit about most things, but the quality of the authority. It became shared, two people reading the same problem and trusting each other's evidence. In late February, Tolef began coughing, not the sharp cough of a cold, a deep, wet sound that came from somewhere below the ribs and left him leaning against a wall afterward with his eyes closed. "Old lung damage," he said. From a winter on the upper Missouri 15 years ago, when he had breathed ice crystals for 3 days straight and felt something tear inside his chest that never healed right. He did not slow down immediately. He coughed and worked and coughed and rode and coughed until the coughing became the rhythm of his days, a percussion that accompanied every task. Marit heard it through the wall of the freight shed where she slept. She heard it in the morning when he saddled the mare. She heard it across the yard when he split wood with a slower, more careful swing than the one she had first watched in the Varley yard. She knew what was happening. She knew it the way children of the frontier knew death, not as an abstraction, but as a familiar, a neighbor who came around periodically and did not always leave empty-handed. One morning in early March, Tolef told her he was leaving. Not dying, leaving. He had a cousin near the Missouri who ran a freight depot in warmer country. He could cough there without freezing. He could work light loads until the lung healed or until it did not. He gave her 3 things. His awl, the one with the antler handle, worn smooth from 20 years of use. A coil of rawhide, the best he had, supple and even, and a notebook of freight routes, hand-drawn in pencil showing every road, crossing, claim, and shelter between the Cheyenne River and the rail points east. "You do not need me for the next one," he said. Marit took the awl and the rawhide and the notebook. She did not argue. She did not ask him to stay. She had learned from the first time, when he left before the blizzard, that asking a man like Tolef to stay was the same as saying she could not stand without him. She could. He had made sure of that. He rode out on a cold morning with the sun flat on the snow and the mare moving carefully over the frozen ruts. Marit watched him go until the mare was a dark shape against the white, and then until the shape was gone, and then she stood alone in the yard of a freight shed that was not hers, holding tools that were, and feeling the particular weight of being trusted. The next emergency came without Tolef. A late March storm, not as fierce as the January blizzard, but fast and heavy, hit during calving season. 2 miles south, a neighbor named Haugen had a barn roof partially collapse under wet snow. The collapse trapped 2 newborn calves in a corner where the broken rafters pressed the hay down to the floor. A young mother named Christy Tveit, the same woman who had asked about infant bedding weeks earlier, was in the barn when the roof fell. She had been checking on a sick calf when the timbers cracked. She was not crushed, but she was pinned under a beam across her legs, and she had a fever that had been climbing for 2 days. The call for help went out the way calls go out on the frontier. A boy on a horse, riding from farm to farm, shouting the situation at each door. When the boy reached the freight shed, Marit was already pulling on her coat. She rode to Haugen's place with Ella Quince, Simeon Bell, and 2 farm boys from neighboring claims. They found the barn half standing, the collapsed section pressing down on the northeast corner, and Christy on the floor with a timber across her shins and 2 calves bawling in the dark behind her. Marit took charge because no one else had a plan. She told Bell and the farm boys to brace the standing section with fence rails jammed under the sagging roof beams, keep it from falling further while they worked. She told Ella to clear the hay from around Christy and check whether the timber was pressing on bone or on the thick fold of her skirt and coat. Then she looked at the collapsed corner and thought about warmth. The calves were alive but lying on frozen ground in an unheated space with no mother and no body heat around them. If they stayed on the floor overnight, they would die. The barn was broken. There was no platform to build. But there was a wagon shed attached to the south wall of the barn, still standing, with 3 walls and a partial roof and a gap where a 4th wall should have been. Marit organized the shed the way she had organized the Varley barn. She hung feed sacks across the open wall. She raised the calf bedding off the ground onto stacked fence rails. She moved the 2 calves and their mother, a cow Hogan brought from the unbroken section, into the shed corner and blocked the windward gaps. She left a vent. The shed was smaller than the Varley barn, 1 cow instead of 8, 2 calves instead of none. The heat would be less, but the space was less too, and the principle held: warm air rises, gathers where it is trapped, and stays as long as the gaps are blocked and the vent draws. She sent someone to ask Amos Varley for help. The boy came back and said Amos would not come unless paid. Bell heard this, and his face went hard. He said, "Note that." And he said it to no one in particular, which meant he was saying it to everyone. Christy was freed from under the beam within the hour. Her legs were bruised, but not broken. Ella wrapped them and helped her into the wagon shed, where the calves and the cow were already warming the small space. By nightfall, the shed corner read 51 degrees inside the pocket, not 75, not the Varley barn, but enough. The calves lived. Christie's fever broke the next morning. If the story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who would understand Marit's kind of courage, the quiet kind that measures before it speaks. Marit walked home from Hogan's place in the dark. She carried Tollef's awl in her coat pocket and his notebook in her hand, and the knowledge that she had done the thing she feared, handled an emergency without him beside her, made decisions with her own hands, and been right. She also carried something else. The look on Ella's face when the calf bedding warmed. The sound of Christy thanking her through a clenched jaw because the fever made speaking hurt. The sight of Bell writing something in his constable's book. Not a crime, but a record, a note about who came and who refused. The method was no longer hers alone. Ella knew it. Haugen's wife had watched her build the shed pocket and asked to be shown the knots. 2 farm boys had learned to test boards with a hammer strike. Christie's husband, who had arrived after the rescue was finished, stood in the wagon shed and held his hand at 3 different heights and felt the difference. Knowledge, Marit was learning, was not diminished by sharing. It was not a coal supply that ran out when divided. It was a thing more like heat itself. It rose, it gathered, it spread, and it stayed. But Amos Varley had refused to come, and the community had noticed, and what the community noticed, the community remembered. By the following autumn, Marit Brekke was hired to inspect barns before storms. The work came to her the way most work came to people on the northern plains, not through advertisement or reputation, but through need. A farmer whose calves had frozen the previous winter heard from Haugen that the Brekke girl could walk into a barn and tell you where the cold entered. Hogan's wife told Dagny Solheim, who told her husband, who mentioned it at the grain elevator in town, where a man named Embret Lunde overheard it and rode 8 miles to find Marit at the freight shed and ask whether she would look at his cattle barn before the first hard freeze. She did not become rich. She became necessary. Farmers paid her in coins when they had coins, in flour when they did not, in nails, butter money, a sack of dried beans, a pair of wool stockings that fit. She kept her earnings in the pouch sewn from Tollef's elk hide, and her tools in a canvas roll she had stitched herself, the awl, the rawhide coil, the pocket knife, a ball of binder twine, and the broken thermometer in its leather sleeve. A typical inspection took half a day. She walked the barn slowly, stopping at every wall, every corner, every post. She held her hand at 3 heights and felt the temperature change. She looked for frost on the inside of boards. Thick frost meant warm, moist air hitting cold wood, which meant heat was leaking and moisture was building. She looked for dust lines on the floor, which traced the paths of drafts. She watched where the animals stood, because a cow will choose the warmest spot in a barn the way water will find the lowest point in a field. The cow does not know why. The cow knows comfort. She marked 3 heights on every barn wall she inspected: floor, stall rail, and roof pocket. She used charcoal because charcoal was free and permanent enough to last a season. The marks became her signature. 3 horizontal lines with a small arrow pointing up, meaning heat rises and here is where it goes. She taught girls and hired hands first, not because she favored them, but because they were the ones most often sent to barns in bad weather. A farmer might stay in the cabin during a storm. His daughter would be sent to check the calves. A hired boy would be told to sleep in the haymow when the house was full. These were the people who needed to know where the warm air gathered, where the cold floor would steal body heat, where a vent must stay open even when the wind screamed through it. She taught them the way Tolef had taught her, not by lecturing, but by making them do it. Hold your hand at the floor. Now hold it at the rail. Now above the stalls. Feel the difference. That difference is the distance between freezing and living through the night. Now tie this lashing tighter. Test it. Again. She taught children to hold a candle under a tin cup the way Guro had taught her. She watched their faces when they pressed their palms to the warm metal and understood in the space of a breath that heat does not disappear. It moves. It rises. It gathers. It waits for someone to find it. The lesson was always the same. The faces were always different, and each time Marit watched a child lift a hand from cold air into warm, she saw her mother's cracked fingers guiding her own hand upward in a calf shed in Minnesota, and the memory did not hurt. It held. The barn inspections brought her to places she had never been. Claims along the Cheyenne, where Norwegian families had built sod houses with cattle sheds attached. German homesteads where the barns were larger than the houses. Irish claims where the walls were stacked fieldstone and the wind came through the joints like thread through a needle. Each building was different. Each building obeyed the same rules. She developed 3 improvements over the course of that first working year, and each one came not from theory, but from a specific failure she had watched or experienced. The first was baffle curtains. On a claim near the river, a farmer had sealed his barn so tightly against drafts that the cattle began coughing from trapped ammonia. The air had nowhere to go. Marit hung feed sacks at intervals along the interior wall, not flat against the boards, but angled, like the baffles inside a stovepipe, so that air could move through the barn in a zigzag path. The baffles broke the direct draft without sealing the space. The cattle stopped coughing within 2 days. The second was raised sleeping shelves for emergency human shelter. After the secondary crisis at Haugen's barn, Marit realized that the platform she had built in the Varley barn was not reproducible in most buildings. It required strong stall partitions, the right ceiling height, and time to lash boards securely. What could be built quickly was a shelf, a narrow plank frame pre-lashed with rawhide that could be placed across any 2 parallel supports and raised above the cold floor within minutes. She built 3 of them and stored them at different farms along the route between the freight shed and town. Each shelf was marked with her charcoal lines, floor, rail, pocket. The third was frost reading. She learned to map a barn's heat leaks by examining the frost patterns on inside surfaces in the early morning. Thick frost on a board meant warm, moist air was hitting cold wood. The barn was breathing in the wrong direction. Thin frost or no frost meant the board was either too warm, good insulation, or too cold for moisture to condense, a gap so large the air passed straight through without touching. She could walk into a barn she had never seen, spend 20 minutes reading the frost, and tell the owner exactly where the heat was leaving and where the drafts were entering. These were not inventions. They were observations sharpened into tools. They were the kind of knowledge that accumulates in the hands of a person who pays attention to buildings the way most people pay attention to weather, constantly, physically, as a matter of survival. Amos Varley's reckoning came during the second winter. Another cold snap settled over the northern plains in late November, not as severe as the January blizzard, but hard enough to test any building that had not been prepared. Marit heard about Amos's problem from Ella, who heard it from a neighbor, who heard the cows coughing from the road. Amos had tried to copy the method. He had seen enough of Marit's platform during the blizzard, and heard enough from the neighbors who visited afterward to understand the basic idea. Seal the barn, trap the heat, sleep above the cattle. What he had missed was the second half. He had blocked every gap in the barn walls. He had packed hay into the roof cracks. He had sealed the lee side and the windward side and the vent gap and every crack he could find, because in Amos's understanding, warmth was something you kept by closing things, the way you kept money by closing your fist. The cows began coughing within 3 days. The air inside the barn turned thick with ammonia, moisture, and the heavy, sour smell of animals breathing their own exhaust. The frost on the inside walls grew so thick it looked like fur. The bedding was soaked. 2 cows developed eye infections from the ammonia. A third stopped eating. The neighbor who heard the coughing told Hogan. Hogan told Ella. Ella told Marit. And Marit, who had every reason to let Amos's barn fail, the way Amos had let her freeze, saddled the freight shed horse and rode to the Varley place. She did not announce herself. She walked into the barn, and the smell hit her 3 steps inside the door. The dense, wet, burning smell of trapped gases that had nowhere to go. The cows stood in their stalls with their heads low, breathing shallow, their eyes watering. The walls were slick with condensation. The hay on the floor was black with damp. Marit walked the length of the barn. She examined the sealed cracks. She looked at the roof, which Amos had packed so tightly that not a breath of air could escape. She looked at the animals, which were standing in the worst possible version of the things she had built. A sealed box with no exhaust, a trap disguised as shelter. She pulled her pocket knife from her coat and cut open 2 high vents on the lee side. The trapped air rushed out with a sound like a sigh. She ordered the wet bedding removed, every forkful down to the bare floor. She told Wade, who was standing in the feed alley watching her with an expression caught between resentment and something that might have been shame, to stop blocking the lee gap and leave it open year-round. Amos came into the barn while she was cutting the second vent. "You come back to give orders now?" he said. His voice carried the tone of a man who has been diminished so many times that even kindness feels like an insult. He stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and the look of someone who wanted to be angry but could not find a target that did not include himself. Marit looked at him. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She did not deliver the speech that the moment seemed to demand, the one about how he had locked her out, how she had survived, how his cruelty had given her the reason and his barn had given her the laboratory. She did not say any of it, because saying it would have made the moment about Amos, and the moment was not about Amos. "No," she said. "I came because the cows did nothing to me." She finished cutting the vent. She checked the remaining seals, kept the ones that blocked direct wind, and opened the ones that prevented air circulation. She showed Wade, who listened, which was new, how to test airflow by holding a wisp of hay near a gap and watching which direction it moved. She did not charge Amos for the work. She did not need to. The debt was not the kind that money settles. When she left, Amos stood in the barn doorway and watched her ride away. He did not thank her. He did not apologize. But he did not close the vent she had cut, and when the next cold snap came, his cows stopped coughing, and he did not seal the barn again. It was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. It was the closest thing the frontier had to a verdict. She was right, and he had been wrong, and the evidence was breathing calmly in the stalls. Jonas Merrick arrived in the spring, when the snow was still melting and the roads were mud, and every building on the plains was showing the damage that winter had done. He was a widowed carpenter's apprentice, 23. Quiet, in the way that men who work with their hands are often quiet, not from shyness, but from the habit of listening to wood instead of people. He had come from a settlement further south to help rebuild a collapsed granary on the Haugen claim, and he was standing in the ruins of the granary with a framing square in one hand and a look of professional disgust on his face when Marit arrived to inspect the attached cattle shed. They did not introduce themselves with pleasantries. Marit was examining a sagging beam above the shed stalls, checking whether it would hold a raised shelf. Jonas was examining the same beam from the other side, checking whether it would hold a roof. "That beam is sound," Jonas said. "The joint failed, not the wood." Marit struck the beam with the flat of her hand. It rang. She nodded. "I need to hang a shelf from it," she said. Jonas looked at the shelf she was describing, the narrow plank frame, the lashing points, the height above the stalls. He understood the engineering immediately, because engineering was what he did. But he saw a problem she had not. "Your lashings hold the shelf to the beam," he said. "But the shelf has no cross brace. If someone rolls in their sleep, the whole frame shifts sideways and the lashings twist." He was right. Marit had noticed the sag in her earlier platforms, but had assumed it was a lashing problem. It was a bracing problem. The shelf needed a diagonal member, a short board set at an angle between the frame rail and the support post to prevent lateral movement. Jonas cut one from the granary scrap and fitted it in 10 minutes. The shelf stopped moving. Marit looked at the brace. She looked at Jonas. She said, "I have been tying those tighter for 6 months when what I needed was a board at 45 degrees. Jonas almost smiled. Rope solves force problems. Wood solves geometry problems. Different tools. They argued over brace angles for the rest of the afternoon. He wanted 45 degrees because it was structurally optimal. She wanted a steeper angle because it left more headroom in the sleeping pocket. They compromised at 50 degrees, and both of them knew the compromise was better than either original, and neither of them said so because saying so would have meant admitting that the other person's objection had been valid. The courtship, if it could be called that, happened through work. They built 3 emergency shelters together that spring, portable inserts for barns framed with pine and braced with Jonas's diagonals and lashed with Marit's rawhide technique. Each one was an argument: where to place the vent, how wide the sleeping surface, whether to use pegs or lashings at the joints. Jonas favored pegs because they were permanent. Marit favored lashings because they could be adjusted. They used both, and the shelters were stronger for it. He did not try to rescue her. He did not offer protection or comfort or the shelter of his name. He offered a framing square, a sharp eye for joints, and the willingness to be wrong about brace angles when the evidence said he was wrong. Marit, who had spent her life surrounded by people who either dismissed her competence or tried to own it, recognized in Jonas something she had not known she was looking for: a person who treated her skill as a fact to be worked with, not a novelty to be admired. They married the following year, after Marit had saved enough wages to buy her own tools, and Jonas had finished the granary and 3 other jobs. The wedding was small. Ella stood as witness. Simeon Bells signed the register. They built a house, small, practical, with an attached work shed where Marit kept her inspection tools and Jonas kept his carpentry bench. The house was not grand. It did not need to be. It was theirs, and the warmth inside it was the kind that comes from knowing exactly where the heat enters and where it leaves, and how to keep the balance right. The years compressed the way years do on the frontier, not smoothly, but in waves, each wave carrying new work and new weather and new faces that needed to learn the same lessons. Marit kept a small notebook, similar to Tolef's freight route book, in which he recorded every barn she inspected: stall height, roof gaps, vent placement, animal count, bedding condition, and where the warm layer settled. The notebook grew thick. The entries grew shorter as her eye grew sharper, because experience turns paragraphs into single words. She and Jonas had 2 children, a girl first, then a boy. The girl learned to tie lashings before she learned to braid hair. The boy learned to strike a beam and listen for dead wood before he could whistle. They grew up in a household where heat was not a mystery, but a trade, where the question was never whether warmth existed, but where it went and how to keep it. By her 20s, Marit was inspecting barns across a stretch of territory that ran 40 miles along the Cheyenne and 20 miles back from the river. She traveled by horse in good weather and by sled in bad. She carried the same tools she had always carried: the awl, the rawhide, the twine, the pocket knife, the thermometer. The thermometer's crack had spread over the years, and the mercury column now stopped at 52 instead of 68. But below 52 it still moved, and 52 was the number that mattered. Anything above 52 in a sealed pocket meant the animals were winning. Anything below meant the gaps were too wide, or the venting was wrong, or the bedding was wet. The local norm changed slowly, the way norms change when they are pushed by evidence rather than authority. No child or hired girl was sent to sleep on a barn floor in the communities Marit served. If a barn was used for emergency shelter, which happened every bad winter because bad winters did not stop coming, it had to have raised bedding, draft control, and a vent path. The 3 charcoal marks appeared on barn walls across the territory, copied by farmers who had learned them from Marit, or from someone who had learned them from Marit, spreading outward like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. Not every barn could be made safe. Not every storm could be outwitted. Marit lost animals despite her best work. She inspected a barn once that was too far gone. Rotten posts, collapsed chinking, a roof that leaked in 4 places, and told the owner it could not be saved. The owner cursed her. She left without answering. There were limits to what knowledge could do, and knowing the limits was part of the knowledge. But families began to understand that warmth was a thing with direction, leaks, layers, and limits. It was not magic. It was not luck. It was measurement and material, and the willingness to climb into a dark space above animals and hold your hand upward and feel what was there. Years later. Enough years that Marit's hair had gone gray at the temples, and her hands had the permanent roughness of a woman who had spent her life gripping rope and wood and frozen iron. She stood in a neighbor's barn watching a girl test the air above the calf stalls. The girl was 14, the daughter of a hired hand, wearing a coat too large for her and boots that had been resoled twice. She held her palm near the floor and frowned. She held it at the stall rail and tilted her head. She reached above the calves into the space where the low ceiling trapped the rising heat, and her face changed. She smiled. The smile was small and private and surprised, the way a person smiles when they discover something they were told about, but did not quite believe until they felt it with their own hand. Marit watched her from the feed alley. She said, Do not trust warmth until you know where it can leave. The girl nodded. She was already looking at the walls, searching for gaps, reading the frost the way Marit had taught her teacher to read it, and her teacher before that, a chain of hands reaching back through cold barns and calf sheds to a woman named Guro, who once held a candle under a tin cup and said, "Heat is not only made by fire, it gathers where it is trapped." Within a few winters of the great blizzard, Marit's raised storm shelves and baffle marks were copied across dozens of farms in northern Dakota Territory. Not every barn could hold them. Not every owner would adopt them. But the idea that a building already contained heat if you knew where to look, that the difference between dying and living could be measured in feet above a frozen floor, spread further than Marit ever traveled. Tolif Asen's freight notebook, with its pencil-drawn routes and shelter marks, sat on Marit's work shelf long after the routes themselves were replaced by rail lines and graded roads. She added her own marks to his. 3 horizontal lines, an arrow pointing up. Marit lived out her later years near the same stretch of prairie that had almost killed her. She and Jonas kept the small house with the attached shed. She kept the broken thermometer long after it became inaccurate, not because she needed it, but because it was the first witness that did not laugh. It sat on a shelf in its leather sleeve, the cracked glass and the stained mercury, and the memory of a night when a girl held it above 8 cows and watched the column rise and knew, in her hands if not yet in words, that she was not going to die. On nights when the wind came hard from the northwest and the temperature fell past 0 and the cabin stove ticked against the cold, Marit would stand at the window and look toward the Varley barn, still standing, still holding cattle, still marked with 3 charcoal lines on the inside wall. She thought of the locked door. She thought of the blanket pushed through the gap. She thought of Wade's voice through the boards, building yourself a coffin with rungs. And she thought of the answer that was not a word but a fact, a girl above the stalls, face flushed, hand on a thermometer, alive in a space that no one had thought to measure until she did. In barns across the territory, the same answer held. A row of girls in a winter barn lifting their hands from floor cold to stall warmth to roof heat, learning the invisible map that Marit Brekke had once found alone in the dark, with nothing but cattle breath and a dead woman's lesson and the stubbornness to measure what everyone else had dismissed. And in the Varley barn, where the warm air still rose above the stalls on cold nights, one of Marit's old rawhide lashings remained tied around a beam, tightened by time, darkened by seasons, holding fast above the place where the heat gathered and would not stop gathering as long as the animals breathed and the gaps stayed blocked and someone remembered which way warmth moves.